Hello, everybody. This session is on fighting poverty with charter cities, the future of governance for the cities of tomorrow and the role of society. The session is put forward by the Students for Liberty, also called the SFL, which works closely with Center for Civil Society and is the largest pro-liberty student organization in the world, with the mission to educate, develop, and empower the next generation of leaders of liberty. Today's session is about delving into the idea of charter cities and how they help in eradicating poverty, further contextualizing it from an Indian point of view and how civil society plays a role in it. Our speaker today, Dr. Mark Lutter, is the founder and executive director of the Charter Cities Institute. He has a PhD in economics from George Mason University. He's an SFL alumnus and credits SFL with helping launch his intellectual career. We also have with us Akash, who'd be asking questions to Mark. He's a fourth year dual degree student majoring in development studies and economics at IIT Madras. He leads academic programs for Students for Liberty in South Asia. A note to the audience, please ask your questions in the Q&A box and we will be taking it up in the last 10 minutes of the session. Mark and Akash, we welcome you both. Over to you, Akash.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Hi. Welcome everybody to this session on fighting poverty with charter cities. So since Asta has introduced this session, let's get right into it. So Mark, thanks for joining us first off, and why don't you start with telling us very introductory stuff about charter cities? What are they?
Sure, thanks for having me. So a charter city is a new city with a special jurisdiction that allows it to have a more competitive business environment. And the basic logic of charter cities is that governance tends to be the most important thing for economic development. If you have a good government, you will tend to be relatively well off. If you have a poor government, you will tend to remain mired in poverty. And the challenge is, how do you actually transition from bad governance to good governance? And the idea of a charter city is to say, look, sometimes it can be very difficult to make these transitions on the national level. The national level has a lot of interest groups, there's a lot of entrenched bureaucracy. And so it might be difficult to make the reforms necessary to jumpstart economic growth. A charter city says, okay, look, in a lot of the global south, there is urbanization. There's about a little bit under 80 million new urban residents annually. India alone, I believe they'll have about 400 million plus new urban residents over the next 30 years. So new urban areas need to be built for these urban residents. And the idea is, okay, well, there needs to be these new urban spaces built, combined with the fact that governance is difficult to change on the national level. But if you carve out areas where nobody lives, where there aren't a lot of special interests, you might be able to implement much deeper governance reforms than otherwise possible. So things like reforming labor law, reforming tax administration, reforming business registration, et cetera, can be done then on the municipal level. You devolve all this authority to the municipal level, create a governance system that is much more suited for attracting investment, for job creation, for economic growth. And then with that, you can sort of, right, like have a successful city and hopefully show that these policies work and then adopt them in the rest of the country. And the most recent, I think, important example of this is in China. So in China in 1980, they declared Shenzhen a special economic zone. And while it's called a special economic zone, it's really closer to a charter city in the set of reforms that they did. It was 320 square kilometers. It was a series of small fishing villages with a total population of around 100,000 people. It was very deep reforms. They pioneered foreign investment reforms, labor law reforms, land reforms, state-owned enterprise reforms, banking reforms. So they really pioneered a bunch of reforms that later spread throughout the rest of China. And so the success in Shenzhen is to a certain extent responsible for the greatest humanitarian miracle in the post-war era, which raised about 850 million people out of poverty. And so charter cities is basically trying to take that model of success of devolving authority to new, basically city governments, and make it applicable more broadly in the developing world.
Okay, that's great. let's get back a bit and let's try to look at the philosophical underpinnings of this idea. So where does this idea come from actually? So why don't you give us a little background where it all started, and if it has something to do with, say, new institutional economics, or being the right institutions being the key drivers of economic growth and prosperity?
Sure. So there's several different intellectual histories of charter cities. To start with what's the most prominent, so Paul Romer, who won the Nobel Prize in economics about a year and a half ago, proposed the idea of charter cities in a TED talk about 11 years ago, I think. And his proposal was to have a high-income country be invited into a low-income country to act as the guarantor. So for example, Honduras might invite Canada to come in and set up a city, with the idea being that institutions matter for economic development and it's hard to do institutional change. So if you invite a country that already has good institutions to administer a city in a low-income country, then this could be successful. Paul Romer had opportunities in both Madagascar as well as Honduras. Neither of these opportunities panned out, and he basically kind of, at least publicly, lost interest. And so a lot of the momentum for the idea died. Then you also have this sort of alternative tradition, what might be called the like techno-libertarian tradition, for lack of a better word, where in the actually 70s, you had a few attempts to create new countries. They were financed by a guy named Warner Stiefel. He was a Jewish survivor of the Holocaust who then made some money in the US. And there were attempts to basically finance, he was worried that the US was going down the same path as Nazi Germany. So he wanted to create a new free society to escape to. They, Operation Atlantis, they put a bunch of sand on a reef in the Caribbean. They were chased off by a gunboat by Papa Doc, who was the dictator of Haiti at that point. Then there was another attempt called Republic of Minerva. They created a small island by putting sand on a reef in the Gulf of Tonga, and then they were chased off by a gunboat from the Republic of Tonga. Both of those projects were kind of crazy, but that intellectual history then filtered down. You had the Seasteading Institute, launched by Patrick Friedman, the grandson of Milton Friedman, that was interested in creating floating islands, but it turned out that the economics didn't work. It's very expensive to create floating platforms. And now Patrick Friedman has launched a small venture capital fund aimed at investing in charter cities. And so you basically have this alternative tradition that is now somewhat merging with Paul Romer's tradition. And then to answer your question about the importance of new institutional economics. So my background, right, I am very influenced by new institutional economics, people like Doug North, Eleanor Alstrom, about the importance of institutions of governance. So if we think about the reforms in many Eastern European countries after the fall of the Soviet Union, some of those reforms were quite successful. Poland, Estonia, for example, but some of those reforms were not at all successful. And so what the lesson of those were, right, you can't really have markets without the institutions underpinning them. And so the challenge was that the Soviet Union and all of its satellite republics had decades of basically totalitarian socialist rule. And so there was an intuition that the idea among some economists was, okay, look, just implement, just create markets and everything works out. And they tried to do that, but it doesn't really work out if you don't have good courts, if you don't have respect for rule of law, if you don't have property rights. And so the outcome was, I mean, it was better than the Soviet Union, but it wasn't sort of up to the hopes of some economists at the time. And the idea of, right, like new institutional economics is taking these, I don't know, institutional underpinning seriously. So thinking about like, what does it actually mean to create an administrative entity to, right, like govern a new city? How do you train the bureaucrats for that administrative entity? Right, like markets are important, but they have to be supported by this broader sort of set of institutions, of governance bodies. And I think the charter city spaces takes that fairly seriously and needs to, is in the stage of actually trying to figure out what that means to implement.
Okay, that's great. So basically we've learned that, cities are drivers of prosperity or economic growth, and we have, as long as we have like more cities, we'll be able to help eradicate poverty. So there is rapid urbanization happening in India and even in Africa. So what's exactly the need here for charter cities? How would they help fight poverty better than what the current system is?
Sure. So I would actually, I guess, push back on your statement that cities fight poverty. They fight poverty in a lot of circumstances, but not all circumstances. So typically the story is, right, somebody moves to a city because they have access to a larger labor market, because they have access to more capital, they are able to become more productive, their incomes rise, they are able to educate their children more, their children have a better life, et cetera, et cetera. That is what happened in most of the West. That is what happened in China. That is not happening in all instances of urbanization today. And so the specific term for that is urbanization without industrialization. And this is happening in much of sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know how accurate, whether this is happening in India, and if so, to what extent. But basically what it means is that people are moving to cities, but their productivity isn't rising. And so this is basically for a number of reasons. One, poor governance. In sub-Saharan Africa, it takes on average 36% of per capita income just to legally register a business. This effectively means the formal economy is shut off from broad parts of the population. There are a lot of barriers to entry for businesses, for trade, for commerce, for hiring, et cetera. Second, cities have relatively poor infrastructure. And so cities are valuable to the extent they are a labor market. They're valuable to the extent that people are able to work and trade with the people around them. But if you have poor infrastructure, if it's a dirt road that gets muddy in the rainy season and you need a big truck to go through it, then even if everybody's living in a relatively small area, it doesn't act as an integrated labor market. And so there are challenges with, people live there, but they don't actually get the benefits from cities. Third is a challenge with land rights. So again, in sub-Saharan Africa, which I'm a little bit more familiar with than India, some cities have as much as like 30% of the property within about, I think, 5 square kilometers of the central business district being undeveloped. And why is it undeveloped? Basically because the land rights aren't secure. And so this lack of secure land rights causes property that should be quite valuable to remain undeveloped and not really contribute to the broader economic progress. So and why is this happening? This is happening in a lot of circumstances, basically because the cities aren't acting as like labor markets, drivers of productivity like they traditionally have, but instead they are acting like basically distribution of rents. So if you are a resource-rich economy, then like the government pays for itself because of oil or copper or cobalt or one of a natural resource that they sell from abroad. Usually a multinational comes in to set up the extraction facilities. And then what happens is all this wealth basically trickles down through the economy, through the city, and people are living on the scraps of this wealth, which is not actually productive. It is just consumptive. And so it's not a situation that leaves the children of the people better off. And I think, like, even if, assuming that there is progress happening in cities, so there are some cities where that still are following the traditional dynamic where people move to them, their productivity rises. The fact that people are doing better in cities doesn't mean that a better environment couldn't make them do even better. And so India, for example, has very strict zoning and land use laws. And so even if Mumbai sees like incomes rise when people move to Mumbai and sees people moving out of slums, people might be able to move out of slums much more quickly if there were better zoning and land use regulations. And my guess is that there's a host of other governance reforms that could be implemented that would accelerate those that economic activity even more. And so that is why I think charter cities are important.
Okay, so let's now delve more into what you advocate and your idea of charter cities, because we've talked about the two strands before. We've talked about Paul Romer and how he advocates high income countries taking over the administration of these cities in developing countries, like the case of Hong Kong, what happened in Hong Kong. But I feel that like what I've read, you don't deem it feasible, and you rather focus on something like a spatial jurisdiction or such. So, but in either case, there are people who would level allegations of this being an example of neocolonialism. So how do you respond to that?
Sure. So first, let me, I guess, clarify the distinctions between our approach and Paul Romer's approach. Like you mentioned, Paul Romer advocates a high-income country coming in or being invited in by a low-income country, typically not to take over an existing city, but to administer a new city. So land that has no or relatively few residents would be identified. If there are people living there, hopefully they would be properly compensated. And then somebody would build infrastructure, and it's called the guarantor country would then administer it. So that might be Canada and Honduras, for example. Our approach is a little bit different because there is, I think, a political challenge of giving up sovereignty, especially to a high-income country that, and given the history of many countries in the global south, there's a little bit of a, I don't know, reluctance to have high-income countries with sometimes the history of colonialism come in and administer parts of their territory. And so what we are proposing is a public-private partnership where a real estate developer comes and develops the land and basically enters into an agreement with the government that allows, creates a special jurisdiction where the real estate developer has influence in the governance of that special jurisdiction for a set period of time. With the idea being, okay, look, it takes probably a few $100 million to build the basic infrastructure for a city. You need water, you need sewage, you need power, you need probably a small port, maybe a small airport, depending on exactly where you build. And so because of the very high initial capital costs, you need some guarantee, the real estate developer will need some guarantee that they are able to recuperate the initial investment required. And that guarantee basically comes by the host country saying, hey, look, yes, we will allow you to have a strong influence on the governance decisions in this city for a period of, let's say, 50 years. That way, if the real estate developer, right, they do this initial infrastructure investment, the land values rise, they attract people over 50 years, the land values could go up like 1,000, 10,000 fold, and that easily pays off the initial investment. And then after that set period of time, then there would be a transfer to the typical governing structure of the host country for cities. And so, I mean, this is obviously can be challenging to a certain extent to get countries to agree with. It's different, it's new, it requires the government. I wouldn't say it's necessarily an infringement on sovereignty, right? Independent central banks basically are a way of a government tying their own hands to empower a new administrative entity to control something that under political control might not lead to the best outcomes. Same with lifetime appointments for judges. There's a lot of methods that democracies use to sort of tie their own hands to create sort of stability and allow for better outcomes. And I see charter cities as falling somewhat within that vein of thought. That being said, while central banks are common, while independent judges are common, lifetime appointments are common, charter cities are not common. So it makes it a challenging conversation. That being said, so far we are currently working on 2 projects, one in Zambia, well actually technically 3, one in Zambia, 2 in Nigeria. In Zambia, we're working with a new city developer called Nkwashi that is being built 12 square kilometers, being built for about 100,000 residents. In Nigeria, we're working with one project called Talent City. It's about 2 square kilometers, being built for like 30,000 residents or so. And it's supposed to be the chain of a number of these sort of cities. The second project in Nigeria is called Indian Economic City. It's being built on 95 square kilometers for 1.5 million residents. And so we basically are taking an incremental approach. In Zambia, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Zambia Development Agency. And they are rewriting their special economic zone laws. So we were, until COVID hit, working with them to help improve their special economic zone laws to make them more aligned with charter cities. Nigeria has relatively extensive special economic zone regulation. And so we're trying to work within that administrative framework to make that align a little bit more with charter cities. Our business model at the Charter Cities Institute is basically to wait till governments or developers approach us. Most of the developers actually all of the developers we are working with are from their host country. So the person building the city in Zambia is Zambian, and in Nigeria it's 2 different Nigerians. And then they invite us and we come in and basically see how to help. And I think, right, like there are 3 important layers of, I guess, voluntariness to our engagement. One, we need the developer to come and ask us, right? We don't go in without a developer coming and asking us. Two, the government needs to agree. So the government needs to say, okay, we believe that this will lead to better outcomes based on our criteria, so we will pass these reforms. And then third, people need to move there. We're not trying to change existing cities. We are trying to engage people who are working on new cities. And so if you like your current institutional environment, then don't move to the new city. And we think that that makes this, I think, right. Like, and then I think an additional point is just colonialism was bad because there were a lot of guns. We don't have any guns. We are a small nonprofit. If people don't want to work with us, they are under no obligation to work with us. And so I think having that the use of violence is an important component of colonialism, and we have no interest in engaging in violence whatsoever. And then I think the last part of your question was, why would a country sort of be interested in this? And I think a lot of countries are realizing the challenges that they face in terms of rapid urbanization, in terms of providing jobs for new residents, in terms of providing infrastructure. These sort of bureaucrats aren't dumb. They realize that it's a big challenge, and they realize that the current system is not dealing with it particularly well. And so most of our conversations with bureaucrats in emerging markets, there is an appetite for this. The challenge is basically, I think, how to get political buy-in and how to structure it in a way that can satisfy all the stakeholders. And that's quite challenging, and that's very dependent on country. But given the sort of scope of the challenge, I think it's quite important.
Okay, so to sum it up, you said that, like, I mean, in charter cities, contrasting it with colonialism, there is no coercion and no condescension, but there's choice, as Roma puts it. Great. So since you've started talking about the project that you guys are doing, why don't you go ahead and tell us more about all the other stakeholders that are involved in the process, and how the city is being financed, where will be the people be coming from, what role is civil society playing, or what role can civil society play going forward in any charter city project?
Sure. So let me, I guess, discuss the projects we're working with, because each is quite contextual. So in Zambia, the CEO reached out to me about 3 years ago. And at the time, this was before I started the Charter Cities Institute. But then I started the Charter Cities Institute and kept talking with him. And their project started because their family owned a ranch that was about 12 square kilometers. The government built a road, like, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, that cut the travel time from their ranch down from like 4 hours to 45 minutes, or 2 hours to like 45 minutes. And so they basically realized, okay, this is more valuable if we monetize it as a real estate development instead of a cattle ranch. And so they hired an urban planner, developed an urban plan, and they are financing it by selling off plots. So they basically say, look, come buy a plot. You're on a 5-year payment plan. After 5 years, the plot is yours, and we will use the money that you are paying us to build out the infrastructure, water, roads, etc. So in a lot of emerging markets, the financial systems are not particularly developed. Zambia doesn't really have much of a mortgage market. So people typically put their savings in real estate. And this is a way for people to put their excess savings in real estate and then also have a nice house in sort of 5 years. The key stakeholders there are obviously the real estate developer. This project is a little bit more simple because they already have a big chunk of land, which can be challenging. Other stakeholders are the Zambian government. We have been working to engage a couple of NGOs to try to get their support, as well as other real estate developers, to see if they would be interested in passing sort of forming a coalition to try to get these reforms implemented. I think there was an article that was just published by a journalist, so it's important to get sort of popular support for the idea as well, because a lot of these will require legislative changes. Some charter cities might even require constitutional changes, and that requires broad social support for them. In Nigeria, with Enyimba Economic City, the 95 square kilometer city being built for 1.5 million residents, we had a charter cities business plan contest. They came in first place. We then basically were working to help them write their regulations, and the regulations were supposed to be submitted to the Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority, but obviously COVID has put everything on pause. And so stakeholders there, they went through a very comprehensive land acquisition process above and beyond what was required by Nigerian law. And so they had to set up a bunch of basically engagement with the local landowners to make sure that their local landowners were getting compensated appropriately and would not sort of, I think they're right, like charter cities, because you need a lot of land, it's challenging to acquire that land. And some governments might just help you force people off, but then that's right, like immoral combined with the fact that you create a group that's going to complain for a very long time, and you probably don't want that with such a politically sensitive project. And so, right, they had a lot of engagement on the local level with landowners. There is the important group of the Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority that needs to approve the regulations. You obviously need investors, you need people to come and build in the charter city, factories, restaurants, shops, etc. And so what is the role of civil society? So far, right, we're a small team, we're 4 people. We haven't engaged civil society that much. We've been trying to. So there's a group that you are probably familiar with, Akash, called Atlas Network, which we have been trying to get interested in charter cities so we could try to engage their partner organizations in emerging markets to help them discuss, to help coordinate the sort of like on the ground support. Because I see charter cities as an idea whose time has come, but part of the idea of, right, like getting the political buy-in requires a broad base of support. With a small team, we've focused right now on building largely the intellectual framework and getting early wins. We're hoping as hopefully COVID sort of recedes and we're able to grow and engage aspects of civil society a little bit more broadly to really help accelerate the development of charter cities.
That's interesting. So what do you think would the legal system look like? Because we have not really talked all that much about legal systems, and I think one of the underpinnings of the idea of charter cities is that in many of these developing countries, the legal systems are very complicated or very sometimes very let's say rudimentary of sorts. So how does the idea of charter cities help overcome that? And in this spatial jurisdiction that you talked about, who would be the judge? Where would the courts be in the cities that you guys are helping build? Could you please put like some more light on that?
Sure. So the way we are approaching it is to basically ask for a blank slate in law and administration. So more specifically, what this means is leave the Constitution the same, leave criminal law the same, leave international treaties the same, devolve everything else to the charter city administration. This means things like labor law, taxes, business registration, land registration, education, environment, everything. And then obviously there is the challenge of creating this new administrative structure. And that's what we are currently working on. So we have, we're developing what we are describing as a Charter Cities Handbook, which goes into all of these different areas of law and gives an outline for how to sort of think about them. What does labor law mean if you're creating it from scratch? And so this process that we're doing involves speaking with various experts. It involves looking at best practices in both high income and low income countries and figuring out what that looks like. And so with regards to courts, there's several ways to approach courts, and this depends to a certain extent on what the goal of the charter city is. So, the Dubai International Financial Center is to a certain extent a charter city. Dubai realized, hey, there's an opportunity to create a financial center in the Middle East. The previous financial center was Lebanon, but they had a civil war, so a lot of the capital wasn't really comfortable there. So they figured, okay, well, we need a financial center, but it turns out Islamic law is not very conducive to international finance. So what they did was they basically created this special jurisdiction, the Dubai International Financial Center, and said within this zone, we're going to use common law. So what they did was they hired a British judge to basically develop it. They've also used Singapore judge, Hong Kong judges, I think maybe an Australian judge. And they basically adopted best practices from common law countries to create this new jurisdiction that many international finance companies are familiar with. So that is one option, to If you're targeting really like big multinational corporations that want a very high degree of legal and regulatory certainty, then you could create the judicial system that is sort of modeled on common law and uses judges with experience in common law countries. That is not necessarily the only path, and that also could be quite expensive because people with significant judicial experience in common law countries have relatively high salary requirements. So the other sort of alternatives we're looking at is you get judges from the local country, and there's the additional question of what legal system do you use. So for example, if you're in Francophone Africa, you might, even though common law is generally considered better for economic development, you might want to remain with civil law because most of your investors, most of your trading partners are probably going to be in France, and they will be more comfortable with the civil law system. And so after you decide what legal system to use, then you can figure out like, all right, who is the target market? Is it wealthy multinationals that do have the resources to spend large amounts on attorney's fees, as well as have this expectation for very high degree of clarity in the regulatory system? Or is it sort of like a local, small, medium-sized enterprises where you're targeting also expats to come and invest in the city? And if you're doing that, then you might want to, right, like form a judicial system that has more experience with the local context, with the local culture, but is also something that is sort of trusted and recognizable as resolving disputes in a fair manner.
So yeah, I remember Tyler Cohen saying that Dubai is a charter city for Indians and Pakistanis, and yeah, that's quite true. That's that was very enlightening, actually. So let's talk about an ideal location for a charter city. What do you think would make a better charter city? Should they be totally greenfield cities in a sense that we start from scratch, or should they be satellite towns to major cities?
I think this depends. Right, the trade-off is if it's a greenfield city from scratch, land acquisition tends to be much easier and you can have it be much bigger. The downside is that the fixed costs are much higher because you need to build all the major infrastructure yourself. Right, the advantage of doing a satellite city is you have access to a labor market, you have access to infrastructure, but the trade-off is that it becomes much more difficult to scale because land acquisition is more expensive and it's probably also more fragmented. So I would answer it's very contextual, right? Like it depends on the fundraising ability of the team that wants to build it. It depends on whether you can identify good greenfield locations that are in the middle of nowhere, because the world has a lot of people. And so a lot of the good locations are probably already taken. I don't think all the good locations are taken, but I suspect a lot of them are. So if you are building a city from scratch, that begs the question of, okay, where are you actually in a greenfield? Where are you building this that is a good location? Maybe like ideally it's on a natural port or a emerging trade route that can take advantage of that trade route. So right, like those are the trade-offs, basically high fixed costs versus easier ability to scale, which depends very much on the team and the context for what they are trying to accomplish.
Okay, yeah, so you recently had the famous urbanist and planner Alan Budd out on your podcast, and he seems a bit of very skeptical of the idea of charter cities to me, because he said in the discussion with Paul Romer, he had said that it's all the good locations for cities are taken. There aren't many of them left yet, and especially that fits well for maybe the Indian subcontinent as well. But now let's look at satellite towns. Let's see if we want to establish them as satellite towns. In case of satellite towns, how do we solve the problem of eminent domain, or like simply put, acquisition of land from those who hold these small titles? And to make things more complicated in the Indian subcontinent, especially, we have legal pluralism in property titles, where like many people who use the property don't really have papers to show their land holding. So how do we deal with all this?
I don't know. I can tell you how they did it in Nigeria. What I would suggest is basically two things. It's one, if you have to acquire from a lot of small landowners, it's probably not going to be worth it. Acquiring from a large number of small landowners is probably too big of a pain to do, especially in countries that have legal pluralism, that have unclear property rights. So my general recommendation, if you're thinking about doing a satellite city, is, right, like airports are typically built on the outskirts of a city. So find the airport, the city's in one direction, go 2 hours in the other direction. Ideally, then you're far enough away from the central business district that there will be relatively cheap land, as well as it will be hopefully in ranches or orchards, or right, like sufficiently large. And typically, right, ranches, orchards do have legal title to their property. These large agricultural estates, which hopefully can get around some of the challenges of land acquisition. And then you might only need to buy like 4 or 5 ranches and orchards to create, I don't know, an area of 50 square kilometers that might be enough to get the city started. Right, in Nigeria, this was, I believe, a several-year process to work with all of the local landowners to buy them out. And they also have challenges with legal title. What they said was, look, if 2 people come and say they have the same title, then we are not going to pay. You need to go back and figure it out. And this works because it was a rural area. And so everybody knows each other to a greater or lesser extent. It will be much more difficult if you're buying in an urban area where the community ties are not necessarily as strong, because the rural areas tend to have traditions and they've known each other for generations. And so that strategy works of saying, look, go back, figure out who has the title, and then come back and we will accommodate that person. And there are organizations like the Omidyar Network, which do a lot on like land rights that could be engaged to make sure that the property rights of the existing land holders are respected. But yeah, land acquisition is definitely one of the major challenges of a charter city. And I don't think very many charter cities will be built in a semi-urban area where there are a lot of existing landowners that need to be accommodated just because the cost of doing so is too high.
Indeed. So let's put things into the Indian context now. The current government has been talking about smart cities mission for I think around 5 years now, but it hasn't really helped. And if we look at charter cities also in India, they haven't really taken off. Like we do have examples of what we can call charter cities, like Auroville down south near Pondicherry, and Jamshedpur in Jharkhand, which was built by the Tatas way back in 1970s, I guess. But the recent ones like Lavasa near Pune, it hasn't been much of a success. So what's your opinion of first, the government's smart cities mission, if you have looked into it, and what's the lesson from Lavasa?
Sure. So I would just to define charter cities, right? Charter cities typically they have a private developer. They don't have to have a private developer, but oftentimes they do. But the key distinction is that they have devolved legal authority to the city level. And so I'm not sure I would describe Lavasa as a charter city. My understanding is that they did not have any legal authority above and beyond what a typical city has. Similarly with Jamshedpur. That being said, my understanding is there's a paper by Alex Tabarrok and Shruti, I am going to probably mispronounce her last name, but Rajagopalan.
Rajagopalan.
Okay.
Shruti Rajagopalan.
Where they look at Jamshedpur and find out that it is actually relatively well governed compared to most peer Indian cities. So I wouldn't necessarily call it unsuccessful. Then additionally, there is so who is the developer? And my intuition is that a private developer who is the majority landowner will develop a city better than most governments, especially in emerging markets, because they're emerging markets because governance isn't particularly good. The second question is, do they have any meaningfully devolved legal authority to allow them to improve on some things like labor law, on business registration, et cetera, things that are typically reserved for the national level government, sometimes the state level government in more federalist societies. India also has, for example, special economic zones that were supposedly modeled on the Chinese special economic zones, but really learned all the wrong lessons. They were too focused on handouts and not on this sort of fundamental change in the rules of the game and the structure of doing business. Then to the question about smart cities, I'm somewhat skeptical of smart cities, right? Like smart cities are basically saying, look, let's use big data to improve city administration. Like this is a good thing, but the problem in a lot of places isn't like the lack of data. The problem is just governments have bad incentives and are making bad decisions. And so what that means in the US context, right? Like the US is responding, in my opinion, very poorly to the coronavirus. And the problem isn't that our leaders don't have enough data. The problem is our leaders are not good at leading and decision making. And so similarly, if you set up a smart city in India, okay, the city governing officials might have much better data, but if the problem isn't data per se, but the problem is just like bad decision making and bad incentives, then having more data will not solve that. And so the second thing I'd bring up with regards to smart cities, and also just regards to, I think, charter cities more generally, one of the challenges is making them accessible to lower income segments of the population. Currently, most of the real estate developers who are building new cities are building them for middle income or above segments of the population. Why? Because that is the business model that works. That is how they can get financing. That is how they can build it out. What that means is that even if like these are successful projects monetarily, and even if they lead to better outcomes for those segments of society, they don't really help the sort of people who need it most. And I think one of the challenges of charter cities that we're beginning to tackle and beginning to think about is, okay, how do you actually create a model where you allow the lower income segments to benefit from the charter city, to move to the charter city? How can you create that to make sure that the charter city isn't losing money, because they're not going to do it if they're losing money on every new lower income resident? But how do you create the financial model? How do you allow them to benefit from the improvements of productivity and the improvements of governance? The answer is we don't really know yet, but we're, I think, starting to figure it out. There's a new city development in Kenya called Tatu City, and they have a project in it called Oaklands. Most of it is what was basically a sort of standard suburb, right? Like nice single houses. They've got a little bit of a central business district. They have something of an industrial park. They also have this park called Oaklands, where they didn't build out any of the infrastructure. They just sold plots. And so there isn't easy access to water or electricity. If you want it, you have to string it up yourself. But because the plots are so much cheaper, people still like to move there because Kenya has a lot of lower income residents who can't afford the fully serviced plots. And I think the hope is that because now this is being developed in this context, over time, the residents can become better off, and then you start sort of connecting the plots to electricity, to water, et cetera, as their incomes rise. And the hope is that that can serve as a broader model for how charter cities could really successfully target lower income segments of the population. But I think right now it's a little bit too early to say conclusively.
Okay, to go back, we were talking about Auroville and Jamshedpur and Lavasa as well. So I was actually saying that Auroville and Jamshedpur are successes, but they date back decades, and there hasn't been any recent development apart from Lavasa. Somebody from the audience, he's saying that Lavasa is a partial success considering they built it successfully and at least 1 million tourists visit it every year. They got bankrupt because he thinks that the politics that meddled with their business for many years that broke their back. So going back to that, I'd like to ask you that isn't there a catch-22 situation of sorts in trying to build charter cities in developing countries, because there is a lot of corruption, there is maybe also lack of respect for property rights. So isn't there a catch-22 situation where even the permission for a charter city is sort of an admittance for corruption and incompetence by the host government?
Yes, that's what makes it hard. If the countries were well governed, they wouldn't necessarily need a charter city. And so the trick is, right, like you're walking this political line where you're trying to introduce good institutions in countries that generally don't have them. That being said, there are instances of this happening in somewhat similar lines. In the development literature, it's called pockets of effectiveness. So there's a book about it. It focuses on Ghana, which is a relatively well-governed country in sub-Saharan Africa, but some parts are not very well governed and some parts are very well governed. And so it basically demonstrates that, look, even in these situations where governance isn't working very well, it's possible to have these like individual agencies, et cetera, that are operating very effectively on meritocratic standards, being able to deliver their projects, et cetera. So one example, maybe people in your audience are more familiar with it, but I've heard, for example, that Bangladesh within the textile industry has very little corruption. So Bangladesh as a whole is not a very well-governed place. It scores poorly on, for example, the World Bank Doing Business Index, but basically they decided, look, we need to develop, and textile manufacturing is sort of the first step on that stage of development. So we're just gonna make sure that there isn't corruption in the textile manufacturing sector. There was a similar deal in, I forget what country it was, maybe it was the Czech Republic or like Slovenia, one of these middle or Eastern European countries. And what happened was they wanted to attract German car manufacturers in the supply chain. And these countries are also not super well governed. There's a lot of corruption, but they basically realized, look, if we want to create these jobs, if we want to get the Germans to come and invest, then we need to make sure that this sector, namely like car manufacturing parts, doesn't have the corruption that's typically associated with our society. And they did that, and they that allowed for the attraction of this investment. And while the rest of society still has the old levels of sort of, I don't know, bureaucratic dysfunction, that sector has been relatively well governed. And so, yeah, there is this sort of walking a tightrope to try to get a country that isn't particularly well governed to create a pocket of it that is well governed, but that does have precedent. And we think that with the charter cities framing, because it's a city, it's the sort of minimum viable unit for sustained economic growth, it can have really powerful impacts down the line.
Okay, great. So we have less than 10 minutes left. Let's look at something that we haven't really looked at for these 15 minutes, and something I really find interesting about charter cities. Charter cities also seem to be, to me at least, very like ideal sandboxes for innovation, to trying out new things. So we could try out things like the Harberger Tax as proposed by Eric Posner and Glenvale in radical markets. And I believe you collaborated with Glenvale before for radical exchange. So could you shed some more light on it? And also for the benefit of the audience, could you also explain the Harberger Tax?
Sure, so the Harberger Tax is, it's the idea to, you would publicly declare the value of your property and you would get taxed at that. So we can imagine a commercial property like a shopping mall. The owner of the shopping mall then publicly declares the value of the property, let's say $10 million, and they would pay a fixed tax rate on that 10 million. Because they're paying a tax rate on that 10 million, their incentive is to declare a value, a low value. On the other hand, anybody can buy it at their self-appraised value. So they declare the value of the shopping mall at 10 million. That means they pay a tax of, let's say, I don't know, 1% annually of that 10 million, but then anybody would be able to come and buy, put up $10 million and buy the shopping mall. And right, so they have an incentive to declare it relatively high to prevent people from coming and buying that asset. And what I find particularly interesting about the Harberger Tax is that it is a sort of new form of property rights that is not freehold land that could lead to substantial improvements in allocative efficiency. So a lot of time today, for example, time and energy is spent trying to find out prices. Some markets are very liquid. For example, like, I don't know, t-shirts. There's a lot of people making t-shirts. It's a liquid market. Some markets are not very liquid. So land in a specific place at a specific time, if it hasn't been sold in 20 years, and no land of that size or shape has been sold in the last 20 years, then it is a tricky process to figure out what the value of that land is. And a Harberger tax can, by forcing people to publicly declare the value of their assets, can serve to allow the assets to be bought and go to higher value uses and save some of that time and energy that is typically spent on what might be called price discovery. This could be implemented in charter cities because if you think about it, right, like a change in this legal structure of ownership is very difficult to implement in existing areas. Some people would benefit from it and some people would lose, and the people who would lose would raise hell and high water to prevent it from happening. Combined with it's just very different from traditional methods of ownership. But in a charter city, because you're starting with what is effectively a blank slate, it is possible to introduce these newer forms of governance that won't immediately run into as much, resistance. And so you can test and experiment with things like the Harberger Tax. Will the Harberger Tax work? I mean, probably some version of it will work in some contexts, but it is not exactly obvious what context and how it will work. And so that needs to be a discovery process, which I think a charter city would be better able to take than others. Another example of a new sort of institutional mechanism, there was a sort of a charter city development launched in Honduras recently called Prospera. And what they are doing is using insurance as the enforcement mechanism for both regulations as well as interaction. So every resident needs to buy insurance, which will insure them if they cause harm to anybody else or their property, then the insurance company will pay it out. And then second, they are able to use any regulatory system they want from an OECD country. So they could say, all right, we're going to use an American regulatory system. The catch is they're not going to, it's self-enforcing. So they're saying, okay, you need to hire your own inspectors to ensure that you're meeting the standards, but anybody will be able to sue them if they're not meeting their sort of self-appointed standards. And so this is a different regulatory mechanism. Will it work? I don't know. It might. Some version of it probably will work, but it's right, like these are complicated details that need to be figured out. But it's easier to implement them in a charter city with a greenfield location than in existing countries where there are all these special interest groups that might be resistant to change.
Okay, thanks. We're running out of time, Mark, so we'll have to close the section now. But thanks to everybody for joining, and thanks especially to you for waking up so early in the morning and joining us here. All of you can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Lutter, and more resources, as somebody asked in the audience, on charter cities can be found, I believe, on the Charter Cities Institute website, cci.city. I'm putting the link on the chat box. And Mark was an alumnus of Students for Liberty, and I'm also privileged to be a leader with Students for Liberty this year in South Asia. And so is Israr, who was answering the questions on the chat box. Thanks again to Astha and the team of CCS, as well as the Nudge Foundation for giving us this opportunity. In case you are interested in Students for Liberty, go find us at studentsforliberty.org. Our local coordinator applications are also open. So if some of you might be students, so do consider joining us this year. Thanks. That was it. We are done 2 minutes early. Are there any other things?
Oh, thank you for inviting me and having me speak Students for Liberty and Center for Civil Society. And yeah, our website is chartercitiesinstitute.org. We have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter account. Feel free to email me and ask any questions if you want additional sort of reading material or engage. I would very much like to be more engaged on the Indian continent because you have the most urban residents over the next 30 years. So I think charter cities can hopefully have a big impact. And thanks for having me.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark, for taking our time and introducing to many of us the concept of charter cities. Mark, you could probably write your email ID and Facebook details on the chat box. That will be very useful for everybody. Thank you, Akash. It was a pleasure to have you both. Lastly, once again, thank you, audience. You've been amazing. And I hope to see more enthusiasm in the room for the coming sessions.